Here's something I have been wrestling with for a long time. It's one lone Bible verse, and I've been looking for a reason to set aside extra time to look at it more closely than ever. I finally decided to just stop waiting and dove into Genesis 3:21. Having a YouTube channel like this is proven to be a good motivator for diving deeper than normal into my Bible. And what ends up here is often like a byproduct or an outlet for what I'm learning. I want to mention up front that this is far from a firm conclusion about everything that's in Genesis 3:21 and what it really and fully tells us. Just for example, I have only learned enough about the ancient Hebrew language to know I have a lot more left to learn. As much as ever, I want this to be like us taking a walk together, and I welcome your thoughts and your insights, and even some loving pushback. In my favorite copy of the Bible, the pages of the first 3 chapters in Genesis have more highlights and more notes than any other place in it. I've spent more time in the first 3 chapters of the Bible than any other portion. In this video, I'm going to share some of the things that have been standing out to me in Genesis 3:21 over the past few months, and some of the thoughts that have been swirling in my brain. By working on it here, and hopefully seeing thoughts from people like you, I'll see if any of the thoughts of mine are worth pursuing, if there are things I need to correct, or if there are things I just need to forget about. I feel like I should mention up front that contrary to what some people have tried to convince me over the years, I don't believe we can or even need to know how much time was covered in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And we don't know how much time passed between Adam and Eve being deceived by Satan and the scene in Genesis 3:21. Nonetheless, that often overlooked verse describes something huge that happened as they were leaving Eden. From what I've been able to learn so far, the New International Version seems as close to the original wording as any English version of the Bible. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. As I said, this is not going to be like most studies I put together, especially because I'm still very much studying this verse. And I'm still a long way from being able to bring it in front of a group as a teacher. I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of scribbles, but not much of that is in any kind of order. So I'll start with something we can be pretty sure of. Believers throughout history have understood Moses to have been the main writer or editor of Genesis. The high-level early learning he received after being adopted into Pharaoh's home comes through in the way he articulated himself. He used 2 distinct verbs in Genesis 3:21. One was the ancient Hebrew word for to make, and one for to clothe. God made garments and clothed them. A little earlier in chapter 3, we're told Adam and Eve tried to make some clothes out of leaves, so they would have already had some idea how to get dressed. If you spent much time in Sunday school, you've likely seen pictures of them in their leafy coverings. And that leads to one of my questions about this verse. Why did Moses mention God making the clothing and dressing them? It seems to me making the skins would have included preparing them, so killing and skinning an animal. And that got me wondering, how has things like skinning and killing been seen in most cultures throughout history? Who does it most? In most cultures I know of, among other things, killing, in this sense, is seen as an intentional act, kind of like a show of power. That is typically associated with masculinity. And I feel like I should mention I'm not crazy using the words masculinity and femininity because, like so many words today, they come with certain baggage for some people. However, I can't think of any better words for what I'm trying to articulate. The verb after the one for making skins in Genesis 3:21 meant dressing or clothing. And in this context, it would have carried a sense of carefully drawing close. Those are generally seen as nurturing and caring qualities that are typically associated with femininity. Many scholars and commentaries on Genesis 3:21 focus on how God provided the covering, how that would have helped cover their shame, and they connect it to what Jesus did on the cross. The imagery is about all of that, but is it at least possible there's more to Genesis 3:21? Is it a subtle but graphic illustration of what the Bible means when it says, male and female, in his image God made them? I've been wondering if it could be, at least in part, to show God with the union of what we culturally consider masculine and feminine traits: tough and tender, bold and nurturing, providing and caring. I want to try to be as clear as possible. I'm not at all talking about feminizing God, nor am I for a nanosecond suggesting we could or should call him anything like Mother God. Jesus only referred to him as Father. All through the Bible, God is repeatedly and constantly referred to as El Shaddai, Elohim, and so on. In the ancient language, and in some modern ones like Spanish, El is a masculine word. A big part of my question has to do with whether God is only El, at least only what comes to mind when most people in the Western world think of a man. My thoughts are being pulled further in this direction by a verse in Genesis that I mentioned earlier. It's 1:26. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness." To reflect his image, male and female, he created. Among other things, the ancient Hebrew word for male would have carried the idea of one who moves toward. It was also used to describe one who pierces. Can you see that in a relational or social sense for the male of our species? What about the physical or biological sense? That would also align with the uniqueness of the male role in terms of initiation and responsibility in Genesis. The idea of responsibility is very important in this. Genesis 3:9-11 describes God's encounter with Adam and Eve right after they ate from the forbidden fruit. The original wording shows God spoke directly to Adam, not to both of them. God directly asked Adam, "Where are you? Who told you? Did you eat from the tree I told you to avoid?" And in all of those questions, the word "you" was singular masculine. The unique level of responsibility for the man seems to have been by design. The word for man or male would have also been like the one who is to remember. That's one of the key things Adam did not do in Eden. Whether he forgot the rule or forgot his responsibility to follow it, he pushed his own mute button. Look at Genesis 3:6. After Eve took her first bite of whatever grew on the forbidden tree, she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Was with her, but didn't say or do anything to stop the rule from being broken. Many word nerds understand the ancient Hebrew word for female or woman as the opened one, or one who receives. That's quite descriptive, just thinking anatomically or sexually. But it also described function or role. Could you see the one who receives in a physical or biological sense? What about a relational or a social one? The word for female or woman was also close to one that meant the breasted one or nurturer. So again, the male, by design, is to move toward. And that carries a sense of responsibility, including initiating and even pursuing. By design, the female tendency is more to receive, to nurture, and to sustain. Now, go to Genesis 2:18. When, after making the man, God said, "I will make a helper suitable for him." I have enormous respect and appreciation for people who take on the massive task of Bible translation, so I don't like sounding like I'm criticizing translations. However, I feel most English versions of this come up short. The ancient Hebrew word for helper there meant more than an assistant, especially more than some kind of a lesser assistant. In the ancient Hebrew, the word was etzar. That word for help or helper appears more than 20 times in the ancient Hebrew Bible, and in most cases it described God as Israel's helper. Everywhere the word was used outside of Genesis 2:18, it referred to divine help, military reinforcement, or some kind of rescue. It was far from a weak or secondary or subservient role. When God said he would make an etzer for Adam, he was not talking about creating an assistant, but rather a strong, vital counterpart who would provide something he was lacking and reinforce where he was weak. In Ecuador, we learned one of the phrases for spouse is media naranja, like the other half of the orange. I like that. Rather than helper, a more literal word might be more like completer. The word for suitable meant distinct but equal. It also meant to stand face to face. The whole phrase would have been like a vital and powerful counterpart, or a co-laborer who strengthens and complements. An essential God-designed partner for helping carry out the creation mandate. It was not a term of weakness, but of strength. In the battle language of the Old Testament, the strongest warriors needed an Eser to survive. And that's what God made the woman to be for the man. When the two genders of humans come together the way God designed for male and female humans, they reflect him as God in ways no other pair of creatures can. Even when male and female are not together in marriage, by God's design, they have distinct and unique traits and characteristics. And I wonder if there's something that gets overlooked in Genesis 2:18, where it records God saying it is not good for the man to be alone. The little ancient Hebrew phrase, not good, is lo tov. Lo was the Hebrew word for not, while tov was often translated good. It could also be used for more than that. Lo tov would not have just meant bad. It meant something was incomplete or unfinished or not functioning optimally. Before Genesis 2:18, everything in creation was described as tov, good. In Genesis 2:18, something was lo tov. Was God saying his creative work was not finished yet? That is, by unveiling the male, God was just getting started on something huge? If we dare press that, could it be that the image of God is not fully expressed in just the male? If both male and female are needed to reflect God's image, was Eve essential to completing the human expression of God's image? Many believe Genesis 2:18 is only about marriage, but could it be about more than that? Could it be that the male human alone was not enough to fully reflect God's image? And more than that, by stating this isn't good, was God saying, at least in part, I'm still working on creation? If male and female together reflect God's image, it seems to me that his nature may not be confined to human gender distinctions, but he encompasses all aspects of what it means to be whole, to be perfectly complete. While I understand how and why the predominant image of God is a human male, I believe we need to be very careful to not limit or restrict God to that gender. This next little part might make you a little uncomfortable, but I believe it's essential, especially for something I'll get into a little later. Out of all of the animal kingdom, humans are uniquely designed for face-to-face sexual intercourse. I'm not going to try to force us to linger here, but based on what we've covered so far, why do you think God designed it that way? What might be some of the reasons? Going back to what I said about the Bible referring to God as El, I want to quickly cover a few verses that caught my attention. They make me think he is more than what we think in terms of him as, especially in terms of limitations we put on that as a gender. The second verse of the Bible tells us, in the beginning, the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The ancient Hebrew word for hovering was used to describe a bird watching its eggs or its babies in a nest. In the Bible, the word is only used 2 other times, and this is one of them. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. Deuteronomy 32:11. Take that imagery back to Genesis 3:21, where God made skins and clothed them. Again, now think about Genesis 1:2, about the Spirit of God hovering. For me, it changes the idea of God as distant or disengaged and brings him right into the nest, and maybe kneeling in front of us to help zip my parka on a cold winter day. How about these words of Jesus? Words he spoke with tears running down his cheeks. Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Consider this question from God. Can a woman forget her nursing child, that she should have no compassion on the son of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I, again, this is God, will not forget you. There's Paul, the rugged, tough, former leading Jewish Pharisee who once would have prayed daily, God, thank you for not making me a Gentile or a woman. He wrote, we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother, taking care of her own children. How about warrior King David, who admitted he was crying out to God when he wrote, you brought me safely from my mother's womb, and you led me to trust you at my mother's breast. I take those thoughts and images back to Genesis 3:21, and I see God covering the man and the woman. I see the power and the strength and the authority of God. And for the first time in my spiritual life, I see tenderness and care and relationality and nurture. When you think of gender, of what we would call masculinity and femininity, is one seen as more God-like than the other? If so, is that merited? Is it healthy? God's image calls us to reflect his full nature. Ministry that only emphasizes power, judgment, and authority, or only emphasizes nurture, patience, and provision is incomplete. Whether in a marriage, a family, or a ministry, what can happen when things get out of balance in one direction or the other? If both strength and nurture reflect God, then relationships, marriages, churches, communities, homes thrive when they reflect that balance. It feels dangerous, risky, and controversial, but I feel like I'm starting to see masculinity and femininity in Jesus. And it's weird because I don't hesitate to talk about his masculinity, but something inside seems to fight against the thought of him crying or being tender. Jesus was the complete, perfect image of God, the lion and the lamb, the judge and the healer, the shepherd and the warrior. Now I'm seeing all those things weaving together as complementary aspects of God's image. I think that's really important today for many reasons. A man who defends and nurtures, is tender or artistically creative, is not less male. A woman who demonstrates strength or leadership or a love for risk and adventure is not less female. Those qualities all originate from God, and he reflects them perfectly. The idea that men must always be aggressive and women must always be soft can distort the full image of God. Just because someone expresses traits traditionally associated with the opposite gender does not mean there is something fundamentally wrong with him or her or needs to be changed. The traits he or she sees and feels can reflect different aspects of the image of God, regardless of whether they're being exhibited by a male or a female. I remember in the 80s finding the first deer I had dropped and feeling exhilaration because of the hunt and the knowledge of what the meat would mean in the coming winter, and yet there were tears in my eyes. I think most women back then would have understood the tears, but most men likely wouldn't have been that understanding, at least not on the surface. I mean, I go back to Genesis 3:21, and I see the killing, the skinning, and the clothing, all done by God. Now, this will be a subject for a fuller conversation another time, but I feel compelled to say this. While male and female were both created to reflect God's image, I don't believe someone has to be married to fully bear that image. I think particularly of single moms. They're not half images of God. Strength and softness, toughness and tenderness, assertiveness and nurture all mirror aspects of God. And I think of Jesus, who led boldly by washing feet, who confronted sin and wept, who commanded and nurtured. He was single and was the perfect reflection of God's fullness. And anyone can reflect that same fullness by growing into his likeness. Now again, and again and again and again, please don't step away from this and tell people this is all something Pastor Len believes or is now teaching. It's still very much at the I wonder stage. As I mentioned, that is especially true because all through the Bible, God is repeatedly and constantly referred to as El. Again, El Shaddai, Elohim. Nowhere in the Bible is God referred to as Elia. I guess a big part of my question has to do with whether God is like only El, and whether I need to have the Holy Spirit work on how I see him fully and completely as God and how he sees me.